She burned her own skin to save her daughter, watching the flames consume the last protection between them and frozen death, knowing that in minutes they would both be corpses in the snow. But then a shadow appeared through the blizzard, and everything she believed about humans, about survival, about the universe itself, shattered in that single moment when a stranger did the impossible. The transport droid spat them out onto the platform of the old dock and vanished into the gray clouds without a sound, its engines fading to nothing in seconds. Tina stood motionless on the corroded metal platform, her blue skin already prickling from the cold that cut through the thin atmosphere like invisible razors designed specifically to flay flesh from bone. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland of Kirill 9, a planet where nothing had grown for 10,000 years, and nothing survived for long except the things that fed on death itself. She knew what exile meant under Lurian law, had known it the moment the judges pronounced their sentence in voices devoid of all emotion. It was a slow execution disguised as mercy, a way for the state to kill without blooding its hands, to let nature do what their laws forbade them to do directly. Her crime had been simple in its execution, but unforgivable in its implications. She had refused to surrender her daughter to the caste of the voiceless, where children were systematically hollowed out through ritual and drug and sensory deprivation, turned into living instruments of prophecy whose mouths spoke words they did not understand, and whose eyes saw visions that destroyed their minds from within. The priests had come to her home on the day of Stellali's third birthday, their robes shimmering with ceremonial threads, their faces painted with the symbols of divination. They had promised that her daughter would serve a greater purpose, that her sacrifice would bring honor to their bloodline for generations, that Stellali would become a conduit for the divine wisdom that guided the Lurian people through the darkness of existence. Tinas had looked into those cold ceremonial eyes, had seen the absolute conviction that her daughter's suffering was not only necessary but holy, and in that moment she had seen only death. Not physical death, which would have been a mercy, but the death of everything that made Stellali herself, the erasure of personality and will and joy until only an empty vessel remained. She had said no. One word spoken quietly in the sacred chamber while the priests waited for her ritual acceptance. One word that condemned her more surely than any violent act ever could. The priests had withdrawn, offended but not surprised, and within hours the security forces had come. They gave her 1 day to prepare, 1 day to gather what possessions she could carry and say goodbye to a life she would never return to. Some of her neighbors had wept for her. Others had turned away, afraid that association with a criminal would mark them as well. Her betrothed, Saris, had come to her door that final evening. She had thought perhaps he would offer to flee with her, to give up his position and his honor for love. Instead, he had handed her the official exile order with his signature at the bottom and told her that duty was more important than desire, that the law existed for a reason, that she was selfish to put one child above the needs of society. She had not cried then. She did not cry now. The platform beneath their feet was slick with ice that had accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries, since this dock had been abandoned by whatever mining operation had once existed here. Around them stretched an endless white desert, broken only by the skeletal remains of industrial equipment, jutting from massive snowdrifts like the ribs and spines of ancient beasts left to rot where they fell. The sky was a uniform slate gray, the sun a pale disk barely visible through perpetual cloud cover that turned day into a kind of extended twilight. The wind carried tiny crystals of ice that stung any exposed skin, drawing pinpricks of blood that froze instantly into dark spots on her blue flesh. Tinas pulled Stellali closer to her body, wrapping the thermal suit tighter around the small form. The child whimpered softly, her completely black eyes half closed against the cold and the fear, her small hands clutching the fabric of Tinas's suit with desperate strength. 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. The temperature plummeted steadily, dropping degree by degree until it reached -60 and continued falling. The wind found every microscopic gap in Tinas's suit, every weakness in the seams and fastenings, probing like a living thing searching for ways to kill. Her fingers went numb first, the sensation fading from her extremities as her body began the automatic process of withdrawing blood from the periphery to protect her vital organs. Then her toes followed, and her ears, and the tip of her nose. She tried to keep moving, pacing in small circles on the platform to generate heat through motion. But each step became harder as her muscles stiffened and her joints began to ache with the deep, grinding pain of tissue approaching its freezing point. Stilali had stopped shivering entirely. That was the worst sign, the indicator that a body was giving up the fight against cold, that it was entering the torpor that preceded death. The child's breathing had become shallow and irregular, her small body limp in Tinas's arms. Tinas's own thoughts grew sluggish, her vision narrowing to a tunnel as her brain received less and less oxygen. She searched her pockets with clumsy fingers that barely responded to her commands, fumbling through the contents with increasing desperation. At the bottom of one pocket, she found the emergency chemical igniter she had smuggled from the transport, palming it while the guards were distracted during the loading process. It was against protocol to allow exiles any tools that might prolong survival, but Tinas had always been good at breaking rules, at finding the gaps in systems and exploiting them. She looked around desperately, searching for anything that could serve as fuel. There was nothing except snow and ice and the metal of the platform and the distant wreckage of machines. No wood, no vegetation, no organic material except their own bodies. The realization hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. She looked down at Stilali, at the blue-tinged lips and the shallow breathing that was getting slower with each passing minute, and made her decision with the clarity that comes when all other options have been exhausted. Tina stripped off her outer thermal suit with shaking hands that could barely grip the fastenings. The cold attacked immediately, vicious and merciless, a wall of freezing air that seemed to have physical weight as it pressed against her skin. She wore only thin undergarments now, barely more than a layer of synthetic fabric against her flesh. Her blue skin turned darker immediately, almost purple in the frigid air, as blood vessels constricted and her body went into shock from the temperature differential. She fumbled with the igniter, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the activation button, and held the small flame to the suit's fabric. For a terrible moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The material was designed to resist fire, to protect against sparks and heat in industrial environments. Then the synthetic fibers caught at a weak point where the fabric had worn thin, releasing a sharp chemical smell as they began to smolder and then burn with sudden intensity. The fire was bright and fierce, but desperately small, barely larger than her two hands cupped together. Tinas held Stilali over the flames, positioning the child's body to absorb every possible drop of heat while her own body began to fail with terrifying speed. She could feel her skin growing stiff and brittle, the cold penetrating through muscle to bone, making her joints grind painfully with each tiny movement. Her lips cracked and bled, the blood freezing in dark lines down her chin. Ice formed in her hair, weighing it down and pulling at her scalp. But Stilali's breathing steadied slightly, becoming more regular, and that tiny improvement was enough to justify everything. The fire consumed the suit quickly, far too quickly, the flames eating through the material and leaving only charred fragments that crumbled to ash. Within minutes that felt like seconds, only ashes remained, scattered immediately by the relentless wind that gave nothing and took everything. Tina sank to her knees in the snow, her legs no longer able to support her weight. She had nothing left to burn except herself, and even that would not be enough, would only prolong the agony without changing the outcome. She wrapped her arms around Stilali and closed her eyes, feeling the numbness spreading from her extremities toward her core, her body shutting down system by system in the face of impossible cold. She thought of her homeworld, of skies the color of sapphires and warm rain that fell like music on the crystal gardens where she had played as a child. She thought of singing in the temple before the priests had declared it heretical, before the laws had grown so strict that joy itself became suspect. She hummed a lullaby under her breath, an old song her own mother had sung to her, the words freezing in her throat and coming out as broken whispers. This was how it would end, she thought with strange calmness. Not with violence or pain, but with sleep, with the gentle darkness that came when the body finally surrendered to forces it could not overcome. Then she heard it, so faint at first that she thought it was hallucination, a trick of a dying brain creating comfort where none existed. A rhythmic crunching sound cutting through the wind's howl, the unmistakable noise of footsteps on packed snow. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. Tina's forced her eyes open, fighting against eyelids that wanted to stay closed forever. Through the blowing snow and the gathering darkness of her vision, she saw a dark shape approaching, massive and angular, with a bright yellow visor glowing like a predator's eye in the twilight. Her first thought, formed in the strange clarity of approaching death, was that this was one of the ice demons from old Lurian legends, the creatures that supposedly haunted the edges of civilization and fed on the souls of the lost. She tried to cover Stilali with her body to provide one final moment of protection, but her muscles would not obey the commands her brain sent them. The figure stopped a few feet away from where she knelt. It was not a demon, she realized as her vision cleared slightly. It was a man in an industrial exosuit, the kind human miners wore in hostile environments, all heavy plates and sealed joints and glowing readouts. Oscar had been returning from a 3-day solo survey of potential titanium deposits in the northern wastes, following scanner readings that suggested rich veins beneath the ice. His mission had been routine, the kind of work he had done 100 times before, alone with his thoughts and his equipment and the endless white landscape. When his suit's sensors detected an anomalous heat signature, a brief spike of temperature in an area where nothing should be generating heat, he had diverted to investigate without really thinking about it. His training said to report anomalies and let the company decide whether to investigate. His instinct said that anything unusual in this wasteland deserved at least a look, because unusual often meant dangerous, and dangerous needed to be identified. He had expected a downed drone, maybe, or a piece of equipment with a malfunctioning reactor. Instead, he found this scene that seemed pulled from a nightmare or a myth. A half-naked blue woman collapsed in the snow, her skin the color of deep ocean water, her body positioned protectively over a child of the same impossible color. Around them lay the charred remains of clothing, still smoking slightly, the pattern of burning obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Oscar had served 8 years in the Colonial Marines before mustering out and becoming a surveyor, had seen people make impossible choices in desperate situations, had watched soldiers give their rations to civilians and medics work on wounded enemies, and engineers jury-rig repairs that shouldn't have been possible. He knew the look of someone who had sacrificed everything and found it still was not enough. The hollow expression of someone who had reached the end of all resources and was waiting for death with open eyes. For a long moment, he stood frozen, his training screaming at him through the rational part of his brain. Maintain suit integrity. Do not compromise your own survival. You cannot help anyone if you die too. These were not just suggestions, but iron laws of survival in extreme environments, rules that separated the living from the dead. But then he looked at the child's face, blue and still, the small chest barely rising with each breath, and something in him broke through the layers of protocol and self-preservation. This was someone's daughter. Someone had loved her enough to burn their own skin, trying to keep her alive. That kind of love deserved at least an attempt at reciprocation, at least a gesture that said the universe was not entirely cold and merciless. Oscar reached up and unfastened the clasps of his outer thermal cloak with fingers that trembled slightly. The heavy fabric, lined with heating elements and insulation, fell to the snow with a soft thump. He was left in his worn chest plate of scarred metal over thermal underwear that was supposed to be sufficient for short-term exposure, but was never meant to be primary protection. The cold hit him like a hammer blow, stealing his breath and making his chest constrict painfully. The suit's internal systems immediately began screaming warnings, red lights flashing on his visor display, temperature alerts and exposure timers counting down the minutes until his core temperature would drop to dangerous levels. He ignored them all, reaching down to pick up the cloak. He draped it over Tina's and Stilali with movements that were gentler than his bulk suggested possible. The woman flinched violently when the fabric touched her, a full-body spasm of fear and surprise. She had expected a blow, perhaps, or to be searched for valuables, or simply to be left to die after the stranger had satisfied his curiosity. Instead, she smelled machine oil and tobacco and human warmth trapped in the fibers, scents that were alien and strange but somehow comforting in their very strangeness. She looked up at Oscar with wide, uncomprehending eyes, her blue irises barely visible around the black of fully dilated pupils. He saw fear there, raw and primal, an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something closer to spiritual defeat. But he also saw fierce maternal protectiveness that transcended species, a determination to shield her child even in the face of death that was identical to what he had seen in human mothers and animal mothers and every kind of mother throughout the universe. Oscar jerked his head toward the darkness beyond the dock, the direction from which he had come. The gesture was clear, even without shared language. "Follow me. Come with me. I know shelter." Tina stared at him for another long moment, her mind struggling to process what was happening, to understand why this human was helping them when his own kind had reasons to hate Lurians, when everyone knew that humans and Lurians were economic competitors and political rivals and had fought proxy wars on a dozen worlds. But she was beyond the point where she could afford to refuse help or question motives. She nodded slowly, gathering Stilali in her arms and struggling to her feet. Her legs nearly gave out immediately, but Oscar caught her elbow with one massive hand, steadying her until she found her balance. They staggered through the storm, moving with painful slowness across terrain that wanted to kill them. Oscar led, his bulk breaking the wind and creating a pocket of slightly calmer air behind him, where the worst of the gusts could not reach. Tina's followed, her legs barely functioning, operating on pure willpower and desperation, rather than any real strength. She clutched Stilali to her chest, wrapped in the human's cloak, feeling the residual warmth seeping into her daughter's body. Every step was agony, her feet numb and her muscles screaming in protest. But she kept moving because stopping meant death, and death was no longer acceptable. Oscar felt the cold attacking him with increasing ferocity, frost forming on his beard and his eyebrows, his thermal underwear providing minimal protection against temperatures that were designed to kill exposed flesh in minutes. His suit's heating system struggled to compensate for the lost insulation, the battery draining faster than normal, warning lights flashing insistently on his display. But he ignored the warnings, just as he ignored the pain in his extremities and the growing fog in his thoughts that signaled the early stages of hypothermia. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes of brutal travel, they reached Station Omega. The research module jutted from a massive snowdrift, like the skeleton of some ancient creature, its walls pitted with decades of wind erosion, its windows dark and lifeless, like the eyes of a corpse. It had been a xenobiology lab once, back when Kirill 9 was still being surveyed for potential colonization, before the companies realized the planet was too hostile and too resource-poor to justify the expense of maintaining a permanent presence. Oscar had discovered it on one of his first surveys and had used it occasionally as an emergency shelter, knowing that even ruins were better than nothing when the storms came. He forced open the jammed airlock with brute strength, his shoulder slamming against the corroded metal until the seal broke with a screech of tortured hinges. They stumbled inside and he pulled the door shut behind them, cutting off the windscreen. Darkness swallowed them immediately, complete and absolute. The air was stale and tasted of rust and decay, but it was still warmer than outside by perhaps 20 degrees, enough to make a difference between life and death over extended exposure. Oscar fumbled for his chemical lantern, his numb fingers taking 3 tries to activate it. Sickly green light flooded the interior, revealing a gutted space that looked like it had been systematically stripped of anything valuable. Rusted walls with holes torn through in places, debris scattered across the floor in frozen drifts, empty equipment racks that had once held scientific instruments now holding nothing but shadows. Tina's huddled in a corner, pressing Stilali to her chest, her eyes darting around the space with obvious fear. She had never seen human technology up close, had heard stories about human brutality and human weapons, and human disregard for life. And now she was trapped in a human structure with a human whose motives she did not understand. Oscar ignored her fear, moving with mechanical efficiency born from years of survival training. He knew this station, had explored it thoroughly during his first visit, memorizing the layout and the remaining resources. He began tearing insulation panels from the walls, ripping loose wiring that had once carried power, dragging broken furniture from side rooms into the main chamber. His movements were economical and precise, despite the cold that made his joints stiff and his muscles slow. Tinas watched him, slowly understanding that he was building a fire, preparing to create warmth in this dead place. The realization brought a tiny spark of hope, dangerous and painful, like blood returning to frozen flesh. Oscar found the station's emergency spark generator in a storage locker that had somehow escaped the looters who had stripped everything else of value. The device was old and corroded, its casing cracked, and its wiring exposed, but it might still function if he could coax life from its dying components. His hands shook violently from cold and exhaustion as he worked, fumbling with the contacts, trying to create the proper connections. The first attempt produced nothing but a weak sputter and the smell of burning insulation. The second attempt was equally futile. The generator's charge too depleted, or the connections too poor to create the necessary spark. On the third attempt, after he cleaned the contacts with his knife and manually adjusted the internal coil, sparks flew in a brilliant cascade of white light. The debris pile caught immediately, dry insulation and old wood and synthetic materials going up in flames that spread quickly and hungrily. Fire rose in the center of the room, dirty and smoky but gloriously hot, radiating warmth that seemed miraculous after hours of unrelenting cold. Oscar sat back on his heels, breathing hard, watching the flames with an expression of grim satisfaction. Tina stared at the fire as if it were a miracle, as if it were proof of divine intervention or magic or something beyond normal understanding. In a way, it was their first victory against death, their first successful defiance of a universe that wanted them dead. The warmth began to spread through the chamber, fighting against the cold that had seeped into every surface, melting the frost from the walls and creating small puddles on the floor. Heat spread through the room in waves, pushing back the darkness and the cold with each passing minute. Stilali stirred under the cloak, her small body responding to the change in temperature with automatic reflexes that indicated life was still fighting within her. Her eyes opened slowly, the black orbs taking in her surroundings with the confusion of someone waking from nightmare into a reality only slightly less strange. She saw Oscar crouch by the fire, warming his hands over the flames, and made a small sound that was part fear and part curiosity. Oscar froze, his body going completely still like an animal that does not want to startle prey. He slowly turned his head to look at the child, his expression carefully neutral. Stilali continued to stare at him with those enormous black eyes, processing this new creature that was so different from any she had known. She did not have the learned fear of adults, the cultural baggage that made Tinas tense and wary. To her, Oscar was simply a being, large and strange but not immediately threatening. Her small stomach made a noise, a growling complaint that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. She whimpered, a sound that every parent in every species would recognize immediately as hunger. Oscar's expression shifted slightly, something softening in his hard features. He slowly reached into his suit pocket, moving with exaggerated care to avoid sudden movements, and pulled out an army ration bar. The bar was standard colonial marine issue, compressed protein and carbohydrates with the texture of chalk and the taste of cardboard, but with enough nutritional value to keep a soldier functioning for hours. Oscar had maybe a dozen of them left in his supplies, carefully hoarded against emergencies. He looked at the bar, then at the child, then at Tinas, who was watching him with obvious suspicion. He did not extend the bar directly toward them. Instead, with deliberate slowness, he placed it on the floor exactly midway between himself and the corner where they huddled. The gesture was one used for feeding wild animals, creating distance and choice, letting them come to the food rather than forcing proximity. It was also, though Oscar did not consciously think of it this way, a gesture of profound respect and trust. Stilali's eyes fixed on the bar with laser intensity. She looked up at Tinas, silently asking permission. Tinas wanted to refuse, wanted to protect her daughter from potential poison or contamination or human treachery, but hunger was a force that overrode caution. She gave a small nod. Stellally scrambled forward on hands and knees with the awkward grace of young children and snatched the bar like a small predator grabbing prey. She retreated immediately to her mother's side and bit into the bar, her small teeth tearing the tough material. She chewed enthusiastically, making small sounds of satisfaction despite the poor taste. Oscar watched them eat, his face showing nothing of what he might be thinking. He reached into his pocket again and produced another bar, this one extended toward Tina's. She hesitated much longer than her daughter had, warring instincts playing out across her features. Pride said, refuse. Caution said, reject. But necessity overrode both. She reached out slowly and took the bar from his hand. Their fingers brushed for just an instant, blue against brown, cool against warm, alien against human. The contact sent a small shock through both of them, not unpleasant but startling in its intimacy. Tina's retreated with the bar and ate slowly, tasting the strange human food with all its unfamiliar flavors and textures. It was salty and dense, nothing like the delicate cuisine of her homeworld, but it was sustenance, and that made it more valuable than the finest delicacies she had ever known. Night fell over the station, though it was difficult to tell on a world where darkness came early and lingered late into what passed for morning. The fire burned lower as the initial fuel was consumed, forcing Oscar to carefully ration what remained. He fed the flames piece by piece, maintaining warmth without exhausting their resources too quickly. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, throwing ice and snow against the station's walls in waves that sounded like artillery bombardment. Inside, the three of them sat in a rough triangle around the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, exhausted beyond the point where conversation would have been possible even if they had shared a language. Then they heard it, cutting through the wind scream, a scraping sound against the outer wall, metal on metal, deliberate and purposeful. Oscar's reaction was instantaneous, his body moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. He killed the lantern with a quick twist, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the fire's dull glow. He pressed a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, his eyes finding Tina's across the flames. She understood immediately without need for words. Predator, hunter, danger. A shape appeared in a breach in the wall that Oscar had not noticed before, a hole torn through the metal large enough for a body to pass through. A head entered first, elongated and streamlined, completely eyeless, but with sensory pits running in regular patterns along the skull and down the neck. A frost claw, blind but with perfect hearing that could detect heartbeats from dozens of meters away, capable of tracking prey across kilometers of frozen wasteland by sound alone, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the sounds of living creatures. Tina's clamped her hand over Stellali's mouth, stifling the whimper that rose in the child's throat. Oscar slowly picked up a metal rod from the debris pile, one end glowing dull red from proximity to the fire. He rose to his feet with agonizing slowness, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The frost claw's head swiveled with uncanny precision, tracking minute sounds that human ears could not detect. Its sensory pits flared and contracted, processing acoustic information and building a mental map of the room and everything in it. It knew exactly where its prey was, could hear the rapid beating of hearts and the sound of breath held in frozen lungs. The creature's body followed its head through the breach, revealing a lean frame covered in pale fur that was almost white, built for speed and killing efficiency. 6 limbs, each ending in curved claws designed for gripping ice and tearing flesh. A tail like a whip, tipped with a bony club. An apex predator perfectly adapted to this world's brutal conditions. The frost claw lunged without warning, crossing the distance to the fire in 2 powerful bounds. Oscar met it halfway, his instincts and training overriding conscious thought. He drove the heated end of the rod forward like a spear, putting his full weight and strength behind the thrust. The glowing metal caught the creature in its open mouth, punching through soft tissue at the back of its throat. The frost claw shrieked, a sound like tearing metal that seemed to vibrate in the bones. It thrashed wildly, its pain making it even more dangerous, and one clawed limb caught Oscar across the shoulder in a raking blow that shredded his thermal underwear and opened 3 parallel gashes in his flesh. The impact threw Oscar backward against the wall, his back striking metal with stunning force. Stars exploded across his vision, and his lungs emptied in a painful wheeze. But he did not fall completely, did not let go of the rod. With a roar that was more animal than human, a sound pulled from some primitive place deep in his brain, where language did not exist, he wrenched the rod sideways and then drove his heavy boot into the creature's skull with savage force. Once, twice, 3 times, each blow landing with a wet crunch that spoke of breaking bone and rupturing tissue. The frost claw's movements became spasmodic, then stopped entirely. Its body went limp, sliding to the floor in a heap of pale fur and dark blood. Silence returned to the station, broken only by Oscar's harsh breathing and the crackling of the fire. Oscar stood swaying against the wall, his hand pressed to his wounded shoulder where blood seeped hot and sticky between his fingers. The cold air stung the exposed flesh, making the pain sharper and more immediate. Tina stared at the dead creature, then at Oscar, her expression a mixture of horror and awe. She had seen Lurian warriors fight, had watched trained soldiers engage in ritual combat, but she had never seen anything like this. The human had moved with a combination of trained skill and raw ferocity that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. He had killed to protect them without hesitation, had put himself between danger and strangers without thought for his own safety. Oscar sank down the wall slowly, his legs no longer able to support his weight. His vision swam and darkened at the edges, shock and blood loss taking their toll. He tried to assess the damage clinically, falling back on combat medic training from years ago. 3 deep lacerations across the deltoid and trapezius. Heavy bleeding, but probably no arterial damage, or he would already be unconscious. Muscle tissue compromised, range of motion severely limited. High risk of infection in these conditions. Needed immediate treatment, or the wound would kill him as surely as the cold would. Tina's made a decision in that moment that surprised even herself. She stood on shaky legs and crossed the room to Oscar, moving with purpose despite her exhaustion. Oscar watched her approach with wary eyes, tensing despite his weakness, some primitive part of his brain warning him that he was vulnerable and she was unknown. But he was too weak to resist effectively, and Tina seemed to understand this. She knelt beside him and gently pulled his hand away from the wound, examining the damage with eyes that were clinical and assessing. Her fingers, cool and smooth and impossibly gentle, touched his hot skin around the edges of the lacerations. Oscar hissed in pain, but did not pull away. Tina reached into her belt pouch, one of the few personal items she had been allowed to keep during exile, and extracted a small container about the size of her thumb. Inside was a substance that looked like moss or lichen, vivid green shot through with threads of silver. Healing moss from the crystal gardens of her homeworld, cultivated over decades in specific conditions of light and mineral concentration, a substance that her grandmother had given her mother and her mother had given her. It was the last physical connection she had to her home, the last piece of a world she would never see again. She had kept it hidden during processing, had smuggled it through security, had preserved it for some unspecified future emergency. She pressed the moss directly into Oscar's wound. The effect was almost immediate. The moss seemed to melt against his flesh, releasing substances that numbed pain and promoted rapid clotting. Oscar felt the burning agony recede to a dull ache, felt the blood flow slowing and stopping. He looked at Tina's with new eyes, seeing past the alien features to the person beneath. She had given him something precious, something irreplaceable, to save a stranger who had no claim on her charity. The gesture spoke more eloquently than any words could have. They were no longer simply survivor and rescuer. They were something else now, something that did not have a name in either of their languages, but that both of them recognized instinctively. Oscar reached up with his good arm and placed his hand over hers where it still pressed against his shoulder. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. "Thank you. I understand the sacrifice. I will honor it." The communication was wordless but complete. Tina nodded back, and for the first time since exile, she felt something other than despair. She felt connection, that fundamental recognition of shared humanity that transcended species and culture and circumstance. They rested through the remainder of the night, taking turns keeping the fire alive and watching for further threats. Oscar's wound continued to improve under the moss's influence, the flesh knitting together far faster than should have been possible. By morning, when pale gray light began to filter through the station's broken windows, he could move his arm with only moderate pain. But morning also brought a harsh reality. Their makeshift fuel was exhausted, the last pieces of debris consumed by flames that now were nothing but ashes in memory. The temperature inside the station began to drop immediately, the cold reclaiming territory it had temporarily lost. Oscar stood and moved to one of the windows, looking out at the landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Tinas joined him, following his gaze. He turned and began drawing in the dust on the floor, creating a crude map with his finger. He marked their current position, then another point in the distance. He spoke a word slowly, emphasizing each syllable. Ravik cluster. Then he held up his hands and flashed all his fingers 3 times. 30. He pointed to the second mark, then made walking motions with 2 fingers. 30 kilometers on foot. Tinas felt her heart sink. Stellalee was stronger after food and warmth, but she was still a small child. 30 kilometers across frozen wasteland was impossible for her. Tinas shook her head firmly, pointing to Stellalee and then down at the ground. Cannot walk. Too far. Too young. Oscar looked at the child for a long moment, some calculation happening behind his eyes. Then he bent down and scooped Stellalee up with his good arm, settling her on his shoulders like human fathers did with their children. The little girl made a startled sound but did not struggle, her hands gripping his hair for balance. Oscar looked at Tinas and jerked his head toward the door. We go now. No other choice. Tinas understood. They could not stay here without fuel, could not survive another night in this dead place. She gathered the remains of the cloak around herself and nodded. Oscar took her by the elbow with his free hand and pulled her to her feet, supporting her until she found her balance. Together, they walked out into the white desert for what Oscar grimly suspected might be the last time. The journey was brutal from the first step. The wind had intensified overnight, creating conditions that were on the edge of unsurvivable, even for someone in full protective gear. Oscar led them forward through sheer force of will, his body breaking the worst of the wind, creating a small zone of relative calm where Tinas could follow. Stellalee clung to his shoulders, her small body adding weight that made each step more difficult, but also providing a tiny amount of warmth against his back. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, the healing moss preventing infection, but unable to completely eliminate pain. They walked for hours, the landscape unchanging around them, a white blur of snow and ice and distant shapes that might have been rocks or equipment, or simply mirages created by desperate minds. Tinas's legs moved mechanically, operating on pure determination rather than any real strength. She focused on Oscar's back, on keeping him in sight, on placing each foot in front of the other, without thinking about how many more steps would be required, or whether they would survive to take them all. Her thoughts became simple and focused. Walk, breathe, walk, breathe. Exist for one more moment, then another, then another. Halfway through the journey, when the sun had climbed to its zenith and provided absolutely no warmth whatsoever, the white fog descended. It was a meteorological phenomenon unique to Kiral 9, a condition where supercooled air dropped to ground level and the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in minutes. One moment they were walking through merely terrible conditions. The next they were in a death zone where exposed flesh would freeze solid in seconds. Oscar stopped immediately, his survival instincts recognizing the danger. He looked around frantically, searching for any kind of shelter. There was nothing except snow. He made a quick decision, dropping to his knees and beginning to dig with his hands. Tinas understood immediately and joined him, her blue fingers clawing at packed snow despite the pain and the numbness. Together, they excavated a shallow pit in a snowdrift, creating a space barely large enough for all 3 of them. Oscar pulled Tinas and Stellalee down into the pit, and then arranged his body over theirs, creating a living shelter with his bulk. He pulled snow over them from the inside, building an insulating layer that would trap their body heat and protect them from the worst of the wind. Inside the snow cave, darkness was absolute, and the air quickly grew thick with their breath. They lay pressed together in a way that violated every social boundary and cultural norm. Oscar's chest against Tinas's back, his arms wrapped around both her and Stalali, creating a cocoon of bodies. Tinas felt the rhythmic beat of Oscar's heart against her spine, strong and steady. She felt his warmth seeping into her, fighting back the cold that had been her constant companion for so long. Stalali lay sandwiched between them, protected by layers of alien flesh, breathing easily in the small pocket of warmth they had created. They stayed like that for hours, waiting for the white fog to pass, listening to the wind howl above them. In that intimate darkness, Tinas thought about everything that had happened since exile. She thought about the choice Oscar had made to help them, about the cloak he had given, and the food he had shared, and the blood he had spilled to protect them. She thought about the healing moss she had used on his wound, her last connection to home given freely to a stranger. She realized that she had forgiven humanity for all its sins. Real and imagined, because this one human had shown her that mercy was possible even in the cruelest circumstances. That sacrifice for strangers was not a weakness, but the highest form of strength. When they finally emerged from the snow cave, stiff and sore but alive, the white fog had lifted. They continued walking, moving faster now, as if renewed by their shared warmth. But new problems emerged as the journey stretched on. Their food supply was gone, consumed the previous night and morning. Oscar's stomach cramped with hunger, his head swimming from exertion without fuel. He could feel his body beginning to consume itself, burning muscle for energy it desperately needed. His vision narrowed and his thoughts became foggy, his body moving more on autopilot than conscious decision. On the second day of walking, with the Ravik cluster still barely visible on the horizon, Oscar reached into his pocket during a brief rest and found something he had forgotten about. A single glucose tablet, the kind medics carried for treating patients in shock, hard candy with concentrated sugar that could provide a quick burst of energy. He looked at it for a long moment, his hand trembling slightly. His body screamed for the calories, for the energy it would provide. But he looked at Stalali, at the little blue girl who had eaten nothing since the previous day, and made his choice without conscious thought. He pretended to eat something, turning his head away and making chewing motions, while he secretly unwrapped the tablet. Then he turned back to Stalali and held out his hand, palm up, the glucose tablet resting in the center. The child took it without hesitation, popping it into her mouth and sucking on it with obvious pleasure. Oscar smiled despite his exhaustion, despite the hunger gnawing at his guts. Tina saw the entire exchange. She saw Oscar's hand go to his pocket, saw the subtle movements, saw the truth of what he had done. Her throat tightened with emotion. In Lurian culture, warrior males never sacrificed. Their rations for children. Resources flowed from the weak to the strong, from the young to the old, from the protected to the protectors. But Oscar had reversed that flow, had given from his weakness to sustain another's weakness, had violated every principle of survival efficiency in favor of something that could only be called love. They walked on through the rest of that day and into the night, moving by the light of Kirol 9's two small moons. Oscar stumbled frequently, his coordination failing, his body pushed far beyond safe limits. Tina supported him as best she could, her arm around his waist, helping him stay upright when his legs threatened to give out. Stalali had fallen asleep on Oscar's shoulders hours ago, her small body trusting completely in the strength of the human who carried her. When they finally saw the Ravik cluster ahead of them, solid and real rather than a mirage, all three of them nearly collapsed with relief. But relief lasted only moments before being replaced by new concern. The cluster looked dead, its lights dark, no smoke rising from its stacks. Had it too been abandoned? Had they walked all this way, only to find another empty shell? Oscar refused to consider that possibility. He forced his legs to move faster, covering the last kilometer with grim determination. They stumbled into the airlock chamber, Oscar's fingers fumbling with the manual override. The mechanism was stiff from disuse, resisting his efforts. He slammed his fist against it repeatedly, bruising his hand, not caring about pain or damage. Finally, the lock gave with a groan, and the door swung inward. They fell through into darkness. Oscar crawled forward on hands and knees, his strength completely gone, and found the emergency seal button through pure muscle memory. He hit it with his fist and the lock hissed shut, sealing them inside. For a long moment, they simply lay on the floor in the dark, breathing hard, not daring to hope. Then Oscar heard it, a low hum, mechanical, rhythmic. He forced himself to stand and staggered forward through the darkness, his hands outstretched until he found what he had prayed would be there. A geothermal generator running in autonomous mode, its core tapping into deep earth heat and converting it to electricity. There was power here, light, warmth, water. They had found sanctuary. Oscar activated the lighting system. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating an interior that was dusty but intact. This cluster had been better maintained than Station Omega, abandoned more recently and with better security. Equipment still lined the walls. Supplies still filled the storage rooms. Oscar found the water system and activated it. A pipe sputtered, coughed, and then began to flow, clean water from a deep well. He put his mouth under the stream and drank greedily, the cold liquid the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He filled a container and brought it to Tina's and Stilali, who drank with the Wainiori to her same desperate need. Then Oscar collapsed against the wall by the generator and closed his eyes. His body had reached absolute depletion. Blood loss and hypothermia and starvation and exhaustion all combined to drag him down into unconsciousness. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Tina's face above his, her blue features creased with concern, her hand touching his forehead. Then nothing. He woke to find Tina's working over him with medical instruments she had found in the cluster's storage. She had cleaned his wound properly, had applied fresh bandages, had monitored his vital signs using equipment she barely understood, but had figured out through observation and experimentation. She had found blankets and piled them over him to maintain body heat. She had found food concentrate and mixed it with water and managed to get some of it down his throat while he was semi-conscious. She had, in short, taken care of him the way he had taken care of her. Oscar's recovery took 3 days. 3 days during which Tina's explored the cluster and inventoried their resources. She found enough food to last months, water for far longer, medical supplies that were comprehensive and well organized. She found clothing that would fit both herself and Stilali after some modification. She found communication equipment that was dormant but possibly functional. She found maps and documents that showed the cluster's location relative to other settlements. Most importantly, she found hope. Real, tangible hope that they might actually survive, might build some kind of life here. Stilali recovered fastest, her young body resilient in ways that adult bodies were not. She explored every corner of the cluster with boundless curiosity, touching everything, pressing buttons, delighting in the simple fact of being warm and fed and safe. She found an old data pad in one of the storage rooms and spent hours making it light up, her small fingers learning the interface through trial and error. Her laughter echoed through the metal corridors, a sound that was strange and wonderful in this dead place. Oscar watched her from his bed, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He had never thought much about children, had certainly never wanted any of his own. His life had been defined by movement and isolation, by the deliberate choice to form no attachments that would tie him to any place or person. But watching Stilali play, hearing her laugh, seeing her joy at simple things, he felt something shift in his understanding of what life could mean. This small blue child was not his by blood or law, or any traditional definition, but she was his responsibility now. He had chosen that when he draped his cloak over her and her mother. He had chosen it again with every subsequent action, and he found to his surprise that he did not regret that choice. On the 4th day, Oscar was strong enough to stand and walk. He conducted a thorough inspection of the cluster, checking systems and assessing their situation. The geothermal generator was stable and would run for years without maintenance. The water system was functional. The air recyclers worked. The structure was sound. They had everything they needed for basic survival. But Oscar's military training made him think beyond basic survival to security, and security raised troubling questions. The Lurian authorities would not simply assume Tina's and Stilali were dead. The collapsed tunnel at Station Omega might buy them some time, but eventually someone would investigate. Survivors would be searched for, tracked, hunted, and when they were found, Tinas would be taken back for execution and Stalali would be handed over to the priests, unless they found a way to escape this planet entirely. Oscar pulled out the cluster's communication equipment and spent hours working on it, testing circuits and replacing components until he finally got it functional. The old long-range transmitter was weak and its signal would be easy to intercept, but it could reach as far as the outer colonies if conditions were right. Oscar waited until late in the station night when traffic would be minimal, then activated the transmitter with a carefully crafted encrypted message. He reached out to old contacts from his Marine days, people who operated in the gray spaces between law and chaos, who owed him favors or who might be willing to help for the right price. The response came 3 days later, a burst transmission that lasted only seconds but contained all the information he needed. Jonas, an old friend who now ran a discreet freight operation, agreed to extract them for a price that would wipe out every favor Oscar had accumulated over years of carefully cultivated relationships. The terms were clear: one pickup, one destination, no questions asked, and then Oscar's slate with Jonas would be forever clean. Oscar accepted without hesitation. He had nothing else to trade except his future connections, and those meant nothing if they all died here. While they waited for Jonas's ship, Oscar began teaching Tinas basic English. He pointed to objects and spoke their names: water, food, door, fire, danger. Tinas repeated the words carefully, her accent strange and melodic, but her retention excellent. She picked up vocabulary with impressive speed, her intelligence obvious despite the language barrier. In return, Oscar learned Lurian words, though his throat struggled with some of the sounds that required tones and inflections that human vocal cords were not designed to produce. They communicated through this growing pidgin language, supplemented by gestures and expressions, and the kind of understanding that developed between people who had survived together. Stalali learned fastest of all, picking up both languages with the effortless grace of childhood. She began mixing them unconsciously, creating sentences that were half English and half Lurian, creating her own hybrid tongue that belonged to no world but to her own unique experience. She became the interpreter when Oscar and Tina struggled to communicate, her small voice bridging the gap between their different origins. During those waiting days, something shifted between Oscar and Tinas in ways that neither of them fully acknowledged or discussed. They worked together, maintaining the cluster, falling into patterns and routines that felt almost domestic. Oscar would check the generator while Tinas inventoried supplies. Tinas would prepare food while Oscar repaired equipment. They would sit together in the evenings near the generator's warmth, watching Stellally play, not speaking much but comfortable in the shared silence. Physical proximity became easier and less fraught with tension. Tinas no longer flinched when Oscar moved near her. Oscar no longer tensed when Tinas touched him to examine his healing wound. They began to anticipate each other's needs and actions, moving around the cluster with the coordination of people who had known each other far longer than the short time that had actually passed. Once, when Tina stumbled on a loose floor panel, Oscar caught her without thinking, his hand steadying her elbow. She looked up at him with those blue eyes and he looked back, and for a moment something electric passed between them. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the shift, the recognition that their relationship had grown beyond survivor and rescuer into something more complex and harder to name. On the 8th day after Oscar's message, alarms began to sound. The cluster's perimeter sensors, which Oscar had reactivated and calibrated, were detecting an approaching ship. Oscar pulled up the scanner display and felt his blood turn cold. The ship's signature was wrong. Not Jonas's battered freighter, but something else. Something with the heavy engine configuration of a military vessel. Specifically, a Lurian assault boat. They had been found. Oscar killed the alarms and pulled up the exterior cameras. Through the swirling snow, he could see the ship descending, its hull a smooth silver that reflected the pale sunlight. It landed heavily, its landing strut sinking deep into the snow. A ramp extended and 3 figures emerged, moving with the confident precision of professional soldiers. They wore armor that was both functional and ceremonial, decorated with rank insignia and unit badges. At their head was a figure Oscar immediately recognized from Tinas's reaction. She had gone completely rigid, her blue skin paling several shades, her breath coming in short gasps. "Saris," she whispered, and Oscar heard a lifetime of pain in that single word. The external speakers crackled to life. A voice emerged, speaking in Lurian, but with a tone that needed no translation. Commanding, arrogant, certain of its authority and righteousness. Tinas translated haltingly, her voice shaking. He says, surrender the child, and I will be granted swift death. He says the law is clear. He says resistance is pointless." Oscar looked at Tinas, at the terror in her eyes, at the way her body seemed to shrink in on itself. He looked at Stilali, who had gone very quiet and still, sensing danger with the instinct of children. Then he looked at the approaching soldiers visible on the monitors. Something inside him, something that had been battered and suppressed by years of cynicism and isolation, suddenly caught fire. He had not saved them from cold and hunger and predators just to let bureaucrats and zealots take them now. He had not walked through hell with them just to stand aside at the last moment. Oscar moved with sudden purpose to the cluster's storage area. He knew what he would find there because he had inventoried it on the first day. Industrial explosives used for mining operations, crates of them, carefully stored and still viable. He began moving the crates to strategic locations, working with the speed and efficiency of someone who had done demolition work before. Tinas watched him with growing understanding and horror. "You will destroy cluster?" she asked in broken English. "If I have to," Oscar replied. He was placing charges at structural weak points, at places where detonation would collapse support beams and bring down entire sections. "They cannot take you if they cannot reach you." "But we all die." Oscar looked at her steadily. "Maybe, or maybe they back off rather than risk their own lives. Or maybe we find a way out during the confusion. I don't know, but I know I'm not letting them take you without a fight." Tina stared at him for a long moment. Then, with movements that were decisive and firm, she crossed to the cluster's equipment locker and pulled out a large pneumatic hammer used for breaking rock. She hefted it, testing its weight, her blue hands gripping the handle with surprising strength. She looked at Oscar, and he saw in her eyes a reflection of his own determination. She was no longer the broken exile waiting for death. She was a mother protecting her child. She was a woman who had decided that hope was worth fighting for, even dying for. Oscar finished placing the last charge and returned to the main control room. He connected all the charges to a single detonator, a crude dead man switch that he could trigger manually. Then he waited, watching the monitors as Saris and his soldiers approached the cluster's entrance. They moved cautiously, weapons drawn, clearly expecting potential resistance. They reached the outer airlock and one of the soldiers began working on the manual override. Oscar picked up the detonator and showed it to Tinas. "When I do this," he said slowly, gesturing to make sure she understood, "everything comes down, no going back. Are you sure? Is this what you want?" Tinas looked at Stellally, who was clinging to her leg. She looked at Oscar, this human who had given everything for them. Then she looked at the monitor showing Saris's face, and she remembered every humiliation, every betrayal, every moment of her daughter's life that had been stolen by laws and customs that valued obedience over love. She nodded once firmly. "Yes, this is what I want. I choose to fight. I choose freedom or death, but I will not choose surrender." The airlock began to open. Saris and his soldiers entered the outer chamber. Oscar waited until they were completely inside, until the point of no return. Then he looked at Tinas one last time, saw her nod of confirmation, and pressed the detonator. The explosion was not as large as it might have been. Oscar had calculated the charges carefully, wanting to collapse the tunnel entrance without bringing down the entire cluster on their own heads. But it was still massive, a roar of sound and pressure that shook the entire structure. Dust and debris filled the air. Alarms shrieked. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in darkness broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in red. When the dust settled and the structure stopped shaking, Oscar checked the monitors. The tunnel entrance had collapsed completely, tons of rock and metal and ice sealing it off. The outer airlock chamber where Saris and his soldiers had been was buried under the debris. The cameras showed no movement, No life signs. Either they were dead or trapped with no way forward or back. Oscar felt no triumph, only grim necessity. He had just killed 3 beings, possibly 4, in cold calculation. The fact that they had been coming to do worse to Tinas and Stalali did not change the fundamental reality of what he had done. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, but he had also bought them time, and in their desperate circumstances, time was the most valuable commodity in the universe. "We need to move on," Oscar said, forcing his mind away from philosophical questions and toward practical necessities. "That ship outside is empty now. If we can reach it, we can escape." But reaching it meant going outside, into the killing cold, across open ground where they would be exposed and vulnerable. And they had no protective gear adequate for extended exposure. Oscar thought frantically, trying to see a path forward through the maze of obstacles. Then he remembered something: the cluster's emergency survival suits stored in a locker near the airlock. He had seen them during his inventory, but had not thought they would be useful. Now they might be their only chance. He found the suits and pulled them out. They were old and their power cells were nearly depleted, but they would provide maybe 15 minutes of protection. 15 minutes to cross the distance to the ship. It would be close, desperately close, but it might be enough. Oscar helped Tinas into one suit, his fingers working the fastenings with practiced efficiency. Then he picked up Stalali and sealed her inside his own suit with him, the child pressed against his chest where his body heat would supplement the suit's failing systems. They moved to the cluster's emergency exit, a small airlock that opened onto the surface away from the collapsed main entrance. Oscar overrode the safety protocols and opened the door manually. Cold air rushed in, stealing warmth with greedy efficiency. They stepped out into the storm, into the white wilderness that had tried to kill them before and would try again now. The ship was visible through the snow, perhaps 200 meters away. It seemed close, but the distance stretched like an eternity. They began walking, then running, Oscar leading with Tinas close behind. The wind fought them every step, pushing against them like a physical opponent. The suit's heating elements struggled and failed, their power cells dying faster than expected. Oscar could feel cold seeping through, could feel his extremities going numb again. Beside him, Tinas was stumbling, her suit's power indicator flashing red. They were halfway to the ship when Tinas fell. She tried to get up, but her legs would not respond, the cold and exhaustion finally overcoming her will. Oscar turned back and grabbed her, pulling her to her feet, supporting her weight as they continued forward. Every step was agony. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. The ship was so close now, just 50 meters, then 40, then 30. They reached the ramp and Oscar practically carried Tinas up it. Inside, warmth and atmosphere and the hum of active life support systems greeted them. Oscar sealed the ramp behind them and collapsed against the wall, his body shaking uncontrollably. Stalali wriggled out of his suit, unharmed, her body protected by his bulk. Tinas lay on the floor, breathing hard, frost covering her suit and her exposed skin. Oscar forced himself to move, to check the ship's systems. Everything was active and ready. The pilot had left it in standby mode, expecting to return shortly. The controls were labeled in Lurian, but were similar enough to human designs that Oscar thought he could manage. He had basic flight training from the Marines, enough to handle a small craft if conditions were not too demanding. He powered up the engines and felt the ship shudder in response. "Can you fly Lurian's ship?" Tinas asked, pulling herself into a seat. "We're about to find out," Oscar replied. He took the pilot's chair and began working the controls, his hands moving with increasing confidence as the systems responded. The ship lifted smoothly, rising from the snow with a grace that surprised him. He oriented them skyward and pushed the throttles forward. The ship accelerated hard, G-forces pressing them back into their seats. They punched through the atmosphere in minutes, leaving Chiral 9 behind as it shrank to a white disk and then disappeared entirely. Oscar set a course for the nearest neutral territory, a trading station called Myron, where questions were not asked and backgrounds were not checked. He put the ship on autopilot and slumped in his chair, suddenly, exhausted beyond measure. Tinas came to stand beside him, looking out at the stars visible through the cockpit window. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her cool fingers gentle against his still warm skin. "You save us again," she said quietly. Always you save us. Oscar shook his head. You saved yourself. I just didn't look away. But even as he said it, he knew it was more than that. He had chosen to become involved, had chosen to invest himself in their survival, had made decisions that bound his fate to theirs. He had ceased to be a detached observer and had become a participant in their story. The journey to Myron took 2 days in the stolen Lurian craft. During that time, they rested and ate and slowly processed everything that had happened. They talked more, their shared languages growing more sophisticated, their understanding of each other deepening. Stilali played with the ship's controls under Oscar's supervision, learning how the vessel worked with the quick comprehension of childhood. Tinas explored the ship and found, in a secure locker, Saris's personal effects. Among them was a data pad containing orders and documents. She read them with growing horror, translating bits for Oscar. The Lurian government had not sent Saris just to retrieve her and Stilali. They had sent him to retrieve them and to eliminate any witnesses to their continued existence. Oscar's life had been forfeit from the moment he helped them. The authorities could not allow word to spread that humans were harboring Lurian criminals, could not allow a precedent that might encourage others to resist or seek alien aid. Oscar had become a target without even knowing it, condemned by his own compassion. I'm sorry, Tina said, her voice breaking. You help us and I bring death to you. You should leave us at Myron. You should disappear and be safe. Oscar looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his brown fingers intertwining with her blue ones. I'm not leaving, he said simply. We're in this together now. For better or worse, we're a unit. Where you go, I go. Tinas felt tears forming in her eyes, the first real tears she had allowed herself since exile. They were not tears of sadness, but of gratitude and relief, and something deeper that she was not ready to name. She squeezed Oscar's hand and nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Myron Station appeared on their scanners like a jewel in the void, a massive wheel spinning slowly in space, covered in docking bays and communication arrays, and the general clutter of a place that served 1,000 different purposes for 1,000 different species. Ships clustered around it like insects around a light source, coming and going in a constant flow of commerce and information. Oscar maneuvered carefully through the traffic, trying to look like he belonged, like he was just another trader coming in from a routine run. They docked without incident in one of the lower bays where security was minimal and discretion was implied. Oscar sealed the Lurian ship and led Tinas and Stilali out into the chaos of Myron's main concourse. The noise hit them first, a wall of sound from hundreds of voices speaking dozens of languages, all competing for attention. Then the smells, a mixture of cooking food and industrial chemicals, and the scent of too many beings living too close together. Stellally pressed against Tinas, overwhelmed by the sensory assault. Even Oscar felt his senses overloading after days in the quiet of empty spaces. They found a cheap room in the lower levels, the kind of accommodation where the proprietor took payment and asked no questions beyond checking that the credits were legitimate. The room was barely large enough for 3 beings, with thin walls that transmitted every sound from neighboring rooms and a recycler that sputtered and dripped. But it had a door that locked and a bed and basic amenities. It was theirs. For the first 2 days, they simply rested. Oscar's body needed time to recover from repeated abuse. Tinas needed time to process everything that had happened, to adjust to the reality that she was truly free and her daughter was safe. Stellally adapted fastest, as children do, finding joy in small things like the way the room's lights changed color or the strange food from the station's vendors. On the 3rd day, Oscar left the room alone to conduct business. He sold the Lurian ship through a contact who did not ask questions about titles or ownership, getting a fraction of what the craft was worth, but still enough credits to fund the next stage of their journey. He reached out to more old contacts, carefully and indirectly, putting out feelers about passage to the outer colonies. He listened to station gossip in the bars and communal areas, trying to gauge whether news of their escape had spread, whether they were being actively hunted. What he learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The Lurian government had issued a statement claiming that Tinas and Stilali had died in an industrial accident on Kiral 9. Their bodies recovered and disposed of according to tradition. Officially, they no longer existed. But Oscar also heard whispers of bounty hunters asking questions, of Lurian intelligence operatives working station contacts, of money being offered for information about a blue woman and child traveling with a human. The official story was for public consumption. The real hunt was still very much active. Oscar returned to their room and explained the situation to Tinas. They needed to disappear completely, to go somewhere so remote and lawless that even persistent hunters would eventually give up the search. Oscar had an idea. Hetty's world, a barely terraformed colony on the absolute edge of explored space, a place where civilization's rules held no weight and survival depended on individual strength and community cooperation. It was harsh and dangerous and not the life he would have chosen, but it offered something more valuable than comfort. It offered anonymity and a chance to start over. "Will we be safe there?" Tinas asked. "Safe as anywhere," Oscar replied honestly. "Probably safer than most places because people there mind their own business. They've all got pasts they're running from. They understand not asking questions." Tinas looked at Stelali, who was playing with a small toy Oscar had bought from a vendor, her black eyes bright with simple joy. She thought about her daughter growing up free, able to choose her own path rather than having one forced upon her by priests and prophecies. She thought about building a life, maybe even a home, in a place where she would not have to hide who she was. She nodded slowly. Yes, Hetty's world. They would go there. Finding passage took 3 more days of negotiations and careful transfers of credits. The ship that finally agreed to take them was barely spaceworthy, captained by a woman named Regina, who had more scars than teeth and an expression that suggested she had seen everything the universe could offer and been unimpressed by most of it. Her ship was a battered freighter that rattled and groaned, but flew, and she asked no questions beyond confirming payment and destination. They left Myron in the dead of station night when traffic was lightest and security was most lax. Regina's ship coughed its way out of dock with protests from every system. But once they cleared the station's gravity well, it smoothed out and settled into a steady burn. The journey to Hetty's world would take 3 weeks through space that was not heavily traveled, following routes that legitimate traders avoided because there was no profit in them. During the voyage, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic between Oscar and Tinas. The constant danger had passed, leaving space for emotions that had been suppressed under the weight of survival. They spent long hours talking, sharing stories of their lives before their paths crossed. Oscar told her about his childhood on Earth, about growing up in a military family where service was expected and questions were not encouraged. He told her about his time in the Marines, about the things he had seen and done, about the reasons he had left to become a surveyor wandering the edges of space. He told her about his mistakes and regrets, about relationships that had failed and opportunities he had squandered. Tinas told him about Lurian culture in all its complexity, about the beauty of her homeworld with its crystal gardens and singing temples, about the rigid caste system that determined every aspect of life from birth to death. She told him about her family, about parents who had loved her but had never understood her desire for something beyond tradition. She told him about Ceres, about how she had believed their betrothal was based on love, only to discover it was based on social advancement and political alliance. She told him about the moment she decided to refuse the priests, knowing it would cost her everything but unable to pay the price they demanded. Stelali grew bolder during the voyage, exploring the ship with Regina's grudging permission. The captain found herself amused by the blue child despite her usual gruff demeanor. "Kid's smart," Regina commented once to Oscar. "Curious, asks good questions. She'll do well if you can keep her alive long enough to grow up." Oscar found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. For years, his life had been defined by movement and isolation, by the deliberate choice to form no attachments that would tie him down. But now, watching Tinas teach Stelali to read using a data pad, seeing the child laugh at something he said, feeling Tinas's hand brush his as they worked together in the galley, he imagined something different, a home, not just shelter, but a real home with roots and history and meaning. Work that mattered beyond simple profit, a life shared rather than endured alone. He caught himself watching Tinas sometimes, observing the way she moved with unconscious grace, The way her face changed when she smiled. The way her eyes reflected light in ways human eyes did not. She was beautiful by any standard, but it was more than physical beauty that drew him. It was her strength, her determination, her capacity to love, despite everything the universe had done to break her. She fascinated him in ways he could not fully articulate. Tinas felt the change in Oscar too. She saw the way his face softened when he looked at Stilali, the way his hands were always gentle despite their size and strength, the way he listened when she spoke, as if every word mattered. She began to see past the alien features and the strange customs to the man beneath. A good man, an honorable man, a man who had proven himself in the ways that truly mattered. One night, unable to sleep in her cramped bunk, Tinas wandered to the ship's common area and found Oscar there, staring out the observation port at the stars sliding past. He held a cup of bitter coffee in his hands, the steam rising in lazy spirals. She sat beside him without speaking. After a while, he handed her the cup. She sipped and grimaced at the harsh taste, but took another sip anyway, wanting to share this small intimacy. "What are you thinking?" she asked in careful English that had improved dramatically over the weeks. Oscar was quiet for a long time. "I'm thinking about how strange life is. A month ago, I was alone, planning to spend the rest of my years wandering from survey to survey, living in my suit more than any real place. Now I'm on a stolen ship with a blue woman and her daughter, heading to the edge of civilization to start a life I never imagined. And the strangest part is, I'm happy, genuinely happy for the first time in longer than I can remember." Tinas felt her heart swell at his words. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "I am happy too," she said softly. "Afraid, yes. Uncertain about future, yes. But happy because of you. Because you show me that universe has kindness even when I think it has only cruelty." Oscar turned his hand under hers, their fingers intertwining, blue and brown, cool and warm, alien and human. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not needing to speak, watching the universe flow past and feeling the connection between them strengthen into something neither could deny anymore. Hetty's world appeared on the scanners ahead of schedule. Regina had pushed the engines hard, eager to be rid of her passengers and collect the rest of her payment. The planet was mottled green and brown, with thick cloud cover and 2 small moons. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but alive with possibility. Regina brought the ship down at the main settlement, a sprawling collection of prefabricated structures and converted cargo containers that had been arranged with more practicality than aesthetics in mind. Oscar led Tinas and Stilali down the ramp and onto solid ground for the first time in weeks. Real ground, not metal or ice, but actual soil. Tinas knelt and pressed her hand to the dirt, feeling the texture, the warmth of sun-heated earth. Something broke inside her, some last barrier of tension and fear, and tears flowed freely down her blue cheeks. They were tears of relief, of grief for everything lost, of joy for everything gained. Oscar knelt beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, offering silent comfort and support. The settlement looked rough and utilitarian, but it was alive with activity. Colonists moved with purpose, working fields and tending livestock and repairing equipment. They looked up as the newcomers arrived, assessed them with experienced eyes, and then went back to their work. No one asked questions. No one demanded papers or identification. This was Hetty's world, where your past was your business and your future depended on your willingness to work. Oscar had arranged for them to stay with Myron, an old acquaintance from his Marine days who now ran a small farm on the outskirts of the settlement. Myron was weathered and gruff, his face a map of old scars and sun damage, his body still strong despite advancing years. He took one look at the 3 of them and grunted. "You'll work for your keep, understand? I don't run charity here. Everyone pulls weight or they find somewhere else to be." "Understood," Oscar agreed immediately. Work was good. Work meant purpose, meant building towards something, meant earning their place through effort rather than charity. The farm was rough, consisting of a few acres of struggling crops, a pen of strange 6-legged animals that bleated constantly and smelled of musk, in a house that was barely more than a shack with walls and a roof. But it had space and privacy and the freedom to exist without fear. They moved in that first night, claiming a small section for their own. Use stellarly explored every corner with delight, marveling at the luxury of space and the novelty of sleeping in a place that did not move or hum with engines. The work began the next morning before dawn. Farming on Hetty's world was brutal, the partially terraformed soil resisting cultivation, the weather unpredictable and often violent, the native life forms competing aggressively with earth crops. But Oscar threw himself into the labor with determination, his strength making him invaluable for heavy work. Tinas learned quickly, her intelligent mind grasping farming techniques and her blue hands becoming calloused and strong. Even Stilali helped in small ways, collecting eggs from the strange birds Myron kept, pulling weeds from the garden, her laughter echoing across the fields. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. They found a rhythm to their lives, a pattern of work and rest that felt almost normal. The other colonists accepted them with the indifference of people who had seen everything. A human and two blue aliens working Myron's farm? Nothing special. Stranger things happened on the frontier. Gradually, Tinas and Oscar began to feel something they had not dared hope for during those desperate days on Kiral 9. Safety, belonging, home. Stellarly thrived in ways that broke Tinas's heart with joy. She grew taller and stronger, her black eyes bright with health and intelligence. She learned both English and Lurian fluently, switching between them with unconscious ease, creating her own hybrid language that belonged to no world but to her unique experience. She made friends among the colony's other children, playing in the fields and streams with the unself-consciousness of youth who knew nothing of species barriers or cultural divisions. Watching her daughter run and laugh and simply be a child, Tinas felt vindicated in every choice she had made, every sacrifice she had endured. Oscar changed too, in subtle ways that were visible only to those who knew what to look for. The hard edges softened. He smiled more often, genuine expressions of contentment rather than the sardonic grimaces that had characterized his previous life. He built a small workshop in one of Myron's unused sheds and spent his evenings repairing things for the colony, refusing payment but accepting meals in gratitude and friendship. People began to trust him, to seek his advice on mechanical problems or to share stories over drinks in the settlement's communal hall. He became part of the community in ways he never had before, integrated into a social fabric rather than hovering at its edges. And between Oscar and Tinas, something unspoken grew with each passing day. They did not talk about it, did not put words to the feelings that developed in quiet moments and shared glances. But it was there in the way they worked together with unconscious coordination, anticipating each other's needs and movements. It was there in the small gestures of care, the way Oscar would bring Tinas water without being asked when she worked too long in the fields, the way Tinas would massage Oscar's shoulders after particularly hard days. It was there in the warmth of shared glances across rooms, in the way their hands found each other when they walked, in the comfort of each other's presence that needed no justification or explanation. One evening, after a particularly long day of harvest, they sat together on the porch of Myron's house while Stilali played in the yard with two other colony children. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were alien yet somehow familiar, beautiful in the way that all sunsets are beautiful regardless of the world. Oscar reached out and took Tinas's hand, his brown fingers intertwining with her blue ones. She did not pull away. They sat like that, hands joined, alien and human, watching their daughter play and feeling the weight of everything they had survived together. "We made it," Tina said softly, her English now fluent enough to carry nuance and emotion. Oscar nodded slowly. "We did. Against cold and hunger and predators and enemies, against every damn thing the universe could throw at us, we made it." "Because of you," Tina said, squeezing his hand. "You save us when you have no reason. You risk everything for strangers." "You would have done the same," Oscar replied. "You burned your own clothes to keep Stilali alive. You fought beside me when you could have surrendered. You're stronger than you know." Tinas was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I love you, Oscar. I know this is strange, human and Lurian, but I cannot deny what I feel. You are, you are everything good in universe. You show me hope when I have despair. You show me kindness when I know only cruelty. You are my, I do not know word in English. In Lorian, we say kashara. It means one who shares your spirit across void. Oscar felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had never been good with feelings, had spent years building walls around his heart to protect himself from disappointment and loss. But those walls had crumbled during those desperate days on Kirill 9, had been torn down by a blue woman and her daughter who had needed him in ways no one had needed him before. He turned to face Tina's fully, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, the courage it took to speak such words. I love you too, he said simply. I don't know how it happened or when exactly, but somewhere between that dock and here, you became the most important person in my life. You and Stilali, you're my family now, the only family that matters. Tina's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Oscar's, a gesture of intimacy that transcended cultural boundaries. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, existing together, two souls that had found each other across the vastness of space and circumstance. The stars came out above them, brilliant and cold and beautiful. Stellally ran to them, breathless from playing, and collapsed between them on the porch. Oscar and Tinas wrapped their arms around her, around each other, forming a knot of warmth against the gathering dark. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work would still be hard. The universe would still be dangerous and uncertain. But tonight they were together. They were safe, they were home, and that was enough.